Chapter 4. Nail Mail. U'umu smacks Coral with a tentacle. "Oh, come now," Coral says, with stern noise to cover up his amusement. "As if you've never had a tune-up before." U'umu doesn't find Coral especially convincing at the best of times, and right now he's threading complicated machinery into U'umu's tendrils, which U'umu has always been squirmish about. Still, the tentacles are one of the better connections to U'umu's core Coral has access to, and it's always better safe than sorry. Even if U'umu is, for all intents and purposes, a completed project. Coral is being thorough. As the meter lights up, the metal walls and floors shine bright in the acid's slight glow, and the glass tubes light the rest of the way. Coral can't help but appreciate the ingenuity of the archive, even after so long working within its walls. He hopes he never forgets to appreciate this house of learning. When U'umu sinks into its habitat to maintain its weight through the diagnostic, U'umu holds as still as it can, so as not to fleck Coral with acid by accident. Coral pats the upper membrane, and U'umu burbles at the touch, still annoyed, sighing with a spray of electric static. Coral pays it no mind. U'umu is as careful with its sparks as the acid, and U'umu wouldn't hurt a lumafly. Almost to the point of being a problem. But Coral keeps that thought to himself, because self-defense is not the concern of a pen-pushing archivist. "Open up," says Coral, which U'umu, of course, doesn't understand, because U'umu doesn't understand language. U'umu gets the message when Coral pulls out the scalpel, and then, literally, rolls over, the great big pushover. The collected mass of cores at U'umu's center glow a pale green, a lovely complement to U'umu's translucent body, shining bright with the knowledge contained within. The metal probe slides between them softly, careful not to puncture. Somewhere in those cores, Coral knows, is every single thing the archive had ever stored, preserved far more effectively than paper scrolls or stone tablets, and, in turn, the archive a preservation of everything the madam had ever learned. An archive that could self-preserve, heal, and, if U'umu could grow a metaphorical backbone, defend against those that would harm it or its home. Which is, perhaps, a lot to ask of any creature. Some days, Coral regrets creating U'umu. It was a disservice to have created any creature only to serve as a pale reflection of some higher being's life's work. On the other days, Coral regrets only that he wasn't able to make U'umu fulfill its purpose as well as he'd planned. At last, Coral makes contact with the nervous system, and the little glass tube lights up with readouts. Coral watches as they scroll by, all well within optimal parameters. Electroplexus normal, Lapids normal, ocelli performing above expectations. As for the core, archive preservation at 100 parts per 100, diagnostic complete. Coral sighs and sets about the careful task of removing the small probe from U'umu's brain space. "I've made you too well," he admonishes U'umu. "You hardly provide me distraction anymore." U'umu, of course, can't understand what Coral was saying. Despite containing the entire archive, U'umu can't read or interact with the records. It simply hadn't occurred to Coral when he'd drawn the blueprints. Indeed, U'umu is much more intelligent than most of its brethren, by simple virtue of size. And with intelligence came a personality only as a happy, unfortunate consequence. If only because the personality had been so unexpected, Coral enjoys U'umu's company for sure, and looks forward to their time together. But now, when Coral needs it most, he's rudely reminded that he never made U'umu to be a companion. U'umu was created to do two things, to preserve and to guard. "Well, you'll never forget, even if I do," says Coral, and smooths the membrane back down. Electricity sparks, and U'umu sinks into the acid to wet the skin to better let the membrane knit back together. As it is, Coral pulls out a strip of spare membrane to apply to the seam, which is nearly instantly absorbed into U'umu's greater body mass. U'umu'u pops back up, dripping acid, but doesn't dare shake itself off with Coral so close by. I won't let my focus wander again, Coral says to U'umu'u, packing up his diagnostic tools. Nothing so dangerous nowadays as to let the focus wander. U'umu'u begins to drift off, literally, floating up into the high-arched ceilings like an untethered cloud raining acid. Coral starts to laugh. Of course, my wandering focus pales in comparison to you, U'umu'u, Coral calls after it. The giant, graceful jellyfish doesn't respond, peering in on the far corners of its home, mimicking the motion of reading them that it's seen Coral and Monomon do so often. It carefully wanders the halls of the archives, familiarizing itself with the layout. The guard patrol routes, the ones Coral made first as a foundational intelligence upon which all the rest of U'umu'u's knowledge rests, so that U'umu'u might never forget it, even if there's nobody left to remind it. Coral's smile slips off his face. But he pops back up almost immediately into a bustle, adjusts his little cloth hat, and makes to put the diagnostic tools away. All the way in the far supply closet, of course. Only sensible that they be thoroughly packed away because the archive needed to be organized and spotless for the upcoming events. That's all. Okay, he's done U'umu'u's monthly checkup and then did it again 2 weeks before it was due. He's cleaned the main floor. He reorganized his desk already. He could reorganize someone else's desk. He could pick up the Fog Canyon map project again. No, he'd need a tool bag from Monomon's room for that. Not that that's a bad thing, but, there's certainly something around here that he could do that coincidentally might require him to not have to go there. He could check the acidity of the water again for the third time. If he pesters U'umu'u again for another checkup, U'umu'u will really be cross with him. A soft chime rings. Coral listens and lets it fade. The sound of acid lapping against the walkways echoes in the halls. The chime rings again. Nobody responds. Coral didn't know why he was waiting for someone to respond. Just goes to show how much grunt work he'd gotten into the terrible habit of shoving off on his TA. Well, Coral was looking for something to do anyway. He quickly puts the diagnostic tools away in their little box on the workbench and makes his way to the mailroom. It hits him halfway there that if he missed them, he'll have no way of getting an invoice from them. And the budget records are part of his responsibilities now too, aren't they? He takes a shortcut through the faculty offices. Standing solemn watch over the silent spaces are long metal desks, all cleaned out, several dusty. Further down are the classrooms, locked behind glass. The Lumafly lanterns hang empty on their stands, occupants moved or sold off as needed. Mostly sold off. Coral had to do those budget records too. Hello? Coral calls as he nears the mailroom. Are you still there? The Uomas can't sign for the package, but I... And Coral opens the door just in time for an Uoma to run directly into his face. Of course, the startled deer spits out a surprised shock and nearly bounces into a metal lamppost. Ah! Coral says, snatching the Uoma away. Careful! What would Madam think of you about rushing around like that? The Uoma shrinks back, and Coral regrets scolding it immediately. Forgive me for my tone, he says. But what have we said about rushing in the hallways? He holds out a conciliatory finger. The Uoma wraps a tendril around it and buzzes happily. Safety first, he agrees, especially as the stress of the times wears on us all. An Uoma, tendrils full of poorly organized letters, buzzes to get Coral's attention. It points one of its very strained arms towards the large pile of mail by the door. Uumas and Uomas all hover over the pile, picking up what pieces they can and carrying them off, dropping letters through their slippery, clumsy tendrils. To where, Coral isn't quite sure, but he's also not sure the Uomas and Oomas know either. The cubbies that used to sort mail by department are all empty, and none of the jellyfish seem to even be attempting to categorize the mass of messages, only trying to clear the debris. Actually, he's pretty sure the Uumas don't know how to read. Just as well. Letters are all the same these days anyway. Quirrell thinks fondly of the time he could expect a variety. Grant requests, solicitations, know-it-all job applications, thank you letters, grateful older students, pictures, success stories, pleas for help. More brochures for City of Tears attractions than Quirrell could ever know what to do with. Quirrell always had his TA pick through the influx for the snottiest, most arrogant cover letters for his and Monomon's amusement. Now they only get mail of a single type, reeking of panic and desperation. Even the Uoma sense it. They never touch the letters. Only the Uomas are brave enough. It's watching them work that leads Quirrell to see what they summoned him here for. On top of the mail pile is a long package, thin around and nearly the length of Quirrell himself, certainly too heavy for an Uoma to carry safely. To Monomon the teacher, says the label, for her eyes only. The label marks it as a delivery of the highest priority. It's not the common seal or the hollow nest seal, but a seal in the visage of the pale king, a seal in fine filigree that Quirrell's never even seen before, not even during his days in the guard. Quirrell stares at the label for a long moment, looks back up at the Uoma. The Uoma holds out two tendrils, imitating, without shoulders, the many times it's seen Quirrell shrug. Quirrell sighs. Some people have a strict divide between work, play, office, home, co-worker, and family. Those people, when they came to the archive, always had the most difficult adjustment. Monomon has no concept of such boundaries. She enjoyed sleeping where she works, which is the deep, acidic pools in the archive's floor. She says that it's good for her mind to rest amongst her work side by side, to dream of the joy of her research, and to rise bright and early to begin again with her archive tubes within her reach. She floated often through entire pools full of numbers and words, knowledge scattered in the air and in the water, and let the knowledge she had amassed drift through her membrane, soaking in the pools that she had personally amassed of Holonest's deepest knowledge, constructing newer knowledge within her body and bed. In the depths of those pools swam the phytoplankton that she fed upon, and she grew strong and long day after day as she fed upon knowledge and creatures alike. Every so often, when she grew tired of the mulch of phytoplankton and the texts did not float easily through her porous membranes, she would call for an Uoma, and she'd raise her head from her acid pools, and Quirrell would sit along the poolside, and they'd talk through the problem together as she chewed steadily through the Uoma's delicate, tender core, savoring the little knowledge and mind she'd granted to it as she reabsorbed it into her being, savoring the company of Quirrell's meager academic talent. And she, of course, slept in those pools too, dreaming of when she could begin to work again in the light of the next morning. Her head sometimes laid softly on the edge of the pool until Quirrell came to submerge her back into the acid, lest she dry out. When she was done with a project, she'd call for Quirrell, and they'd bottle up the bit of knowledge in its acidic form in a tube tank together. And then she would request fresh acid, or maybe an old, pre-bottled project she'd shelved a while ago, and Quirrell would add the new acid to her pool and new phytoplankton to go with it, and she'd begin again. It sounds, perhaps, overwhelming to live your work, but Monomon works the way she lives, deliberately, steadfastly, contemplatively, patiently, and with unfailing dedication to a vision of the world only she can see, and all else are only privileged to glimpse through her teachings. Monomon's chambers used to be an oasis in the midst of the constantly bustling archives, as professors, who didn't know how to pace themselves or their work, rushed from class to class, and students forgot deadlines and limped through haphazard essays. In the chambers of Monomon's office, bedroom, and home, the high-arched ceilings gently soothed any noise with their sheer volume of calm air, until it became not a distraction, but a pleasant ambiance. There the teacher would float among her displays and texts, deep in contemplation, almost ethereal in the light of the acid tanks. She did her best work here, in the center of the archives, the eye of a storm of ever-expanding academic excitement that remained, for all its vast and multiple moving parts, a storm of her making, a storm of her nature. When Coral opens her door, a saw blade screams through metal. A tiny craftsman is hammering joints into place, clanging them together with swings. The clanging is all out of sync, without rhyme or rhythm. The smell of metal being soldered pervades the room, the scent of burning, sinking deep into the porous acid where Monomon stored her best thoughts. Half a dozen small craftsmen from the City of Tears scurry across the floors, tripping over mislaid tools. They look at the deep pools of acid with a sort of trepidation that comes from not knowing. Monomon still floats in the midst of it all. She gives firm direction and correction as required, as she always has, as if the construction crew is only another class on her schedule. Coral sees her indicating a vital support structure, perhaps informing the architect of another exacting specification she needed, or, more likely, explaining why she needed it. "Madam," Coral says by way of greeting. He bows, of course, the long package tucked neatly behind him. "Scholar," Monomon replies. "Just a moment." She turns her attention back to the architect and says, "The joint simply will not hold. Please inform the metagurist that my request was not optional." The architect bows, much lower than Coral did, but does not move.
"The metalgurist maintains that the blueprints are unsustainable."
"The blueprints that I have drawn?"
She has held firm to her belief.
Monomon goes perfectly straight, with a poise that Coral knows to be her exhaustion. "Tell her to examine the samples again," she says, pulling a long sheet of silk paper from a nearby desk. "There is no mistake."
Yes, very good, madam,"
says the architect hastily, takes the paper, and hands it to Coral.
"Here, mailboy, take this to the metalgurist. She's the one with the highest social mark on her shell in blue."
Coral looks down at the scroll.
"Well?"
says the builder, in a brusque tone of voice that would be rude, if it weren't for the fact that his social class, branded on his shell, was obviously and clearly several ranks higher than Coral's. As the silence stretches longer, the builder frowns.
"Oh, sorry. Are you a cleaning bug?"
"Yes, Squirrel," says Monomon. "Indeed, please do take it. I've only recently gotten into matters of geology and metalworking myself, and I believe that with your, how many years of service to me as head administrator of these archives?"
22 this past year, madam,"
says Coral. The architect blanches. "And department head before that for a decade, were you not?"
"Indeed, madam."
"Yes, I believe you may know something more than myself on subjects of metalwork," says Monomon. "Either way, I'm sure that a mind of your caliber will take great pleasure in a bit of light reading such as this." Coral undoes the scroll, covered in nearly incomprehensible shorthand, dense mathematical equations stretching side to side, and various esoteric jargon as long as his fingers.
"Compelling work, as always, madam," says Coral. "I shall take a peek the next time I'd like to unwind over something simple." "I deeply apologize," says the architect, who looks less so much wrong-footed, as he does like his entire world-view has been upended. The apology is rather unelaborated upon, considering how sorry he claims to be. "Regardless," he looks at Coral, then Monomon, in a new light. A light that Coral knows very well, which is that someone has lowered Monomon several points of estimation for keeping such a common bug in her employ. "Regardless, the hatch function does not need to be opened. The metalgurist maintains this point, as do I. There is simply no need for an opening for a tube that will never be reopened."
Monomon looks down at Coral. Coral looks up at Monomon. But my dear bug, says Monomon, in the tone of voice that is in no way different from her usual soft tones, but nevertheless tells Quirrell precisely what the next play that will come out of her mouth is. If the hatch is never to be reopened, how will I feed?
Feed, madam? No, says the architect with a short laugh. I believe you misunderstand the purpose of the seals.
I understand them perfectly, says Monomon. I helped design them. I understand that my body will be sustained through the seal in a stasis. I did not ask about feed for subsistence.
And then she stops there, gentle and sweet as ever. What does, says the architect, who is beginning to visibly sweat. Does that mean?
I am so glad you've asked, says Monomon. I do believe strongly in a hands-on, demonstrative approach to learning, and it seems that today you are so lucky as to learn something new. Quirrell, my dearest student, I believe I have no choice. Please bring me the spoon.
Quirrell freezes. Madam, he says softly, not the spoon.
The builder hesitates.
What spoon?
Monomon bows her head. Quirrell, I trust nobody else with this task but you. This demonstration will be short.
What spoon? Says the builder nervously. Madam, with all due respect, it doesn't have to come to this, says Quirrell.
Does it not? Monomon asks, which is precisely the sort of nonsense question that Monomon usually despises, for it allows the listener to read whatever they like into it. From the whites of the architect's eyes, the architect is reading fear. Primly, Monomon clasps her tendrils together. I leave my will to you, my dear student, she says solemnly, and drifts away, off to examine some other aspect of the construction process.
What? Spoon!
The architect hisses. Quirrell drags the architect by the arm, far out of Monomon's earshot, and draws the poor architect near to him as the picture of urgency.
Listen closely, says Quirrell. I do this out of the goodness of my heart.
The architect nods frantically.
You must do exactly as I say if you want to survive.
The architect looks a bit like he's about to pass out.
I need you to turn around and walk away slowly, says Quirrell. Get the Metagurst. Tell the Metagurst what I've told you, that the joints of the tank's lid must be built with the hatch along the top.
But, my good bug, don't make me go through with this, Quirrell pleads.
The last time we brought out the spoon.
Quirrell trails off, too overwhelmed with sorrow to speak further. The builder might actually be hyperventilating.
Go, Quirrell says. Quickly. Do not look back.
Thank you, says the architect fervently. I shall never ever forget your kindness so long as I live. Quirrell nods with gravitas.
Worry not. I shall handle the teacher's will.
The architect hurries off to the rest of the construction crew, presumably to locate the Metagurst to fix the hatch joints. Now even the bigger bugs of the crew look at Monomon in fear as she pulls herself to her full height and gestures for Quirrell to follow. Looks of admiration that he dare stand in the presence of Monomon and her spoon follow Quirrell as he steps in line after her. They walk in silence around the corner, into the hallways. My dear student, says Monomon.
Yes, madam,
says Quirrell dutifully. It just occurred to me, she says. Do we actually own a single spoon in this building? Quirrell's face definitely remains straight.
Ahem. No, madam.
No? What of the kitchen?
The kitchen was cleared out, madam.
Not even utensils for your own meals?
I possess a fork and knife, madam. A cooking spoon. Ha! Now the madam jests at my expense.
Says Monomon. Then perhaps we should invest in another code word to intimidate the undergraduates and other presumptuous metropolitans who'd judge the worth of a bug by the marks of his shell.
Perhaps, madam.
Beyond the main floor of the construction is a deeper, quieter chamber. Inside, tubes of knowledge, encoded into the acidic water itself, drifts gently, casting their reflection upon the floor. Monomon drifts closer to the floor, and her tendrils coil and uncoil along the metal, following her like the probing vines of Greenpath. Quirrell tells her that this is unnecessary. Monomon maintains Quirrell would break his poor neck holding polite eye contact. Quirrell returns that his neck is hardly a concern, and that the floor here is filthy. Monomon raises a tentacle to her face in mock shock. Quirrell, surely you aren't calling your teacher filthy?
I might be forced to, if she keeps letting her tendrils lay on the floor of a construction site.
Now my chambers are a construction site. You're developing quite a nasty tongue, my student. Quirrell's chest fills with a warm pride, as it always does when Monomon calls him hers. Still,
Madam, please, I worked very hard to earn the title of archivist.
She waves a firm dismissal. And I've thought for years that title was antiquated, entirely the wrong connotations for your field.
My field of being the administrator of the archive?
Your field of study, Monomon insists, as a historian. Simply because you work in an archive does not mean you must refer to yourself as an archiver. To archive is to lock knowledge in place, carve it in stone, to preserve. Important work, vital work. But in isolation it leads to nothing. Stasis, perhaps, and without change there may be no life. History is only important because it
is so closely tied to the present,
Quirrell finishes. Smugness does not become you, my student.
I know not of what smugness you speak. I've only been taught well by an excellent teacher as to the value of having multiple dictionaries on my person at all times, from which to draw one's argument over the definition of a word. And, perhaps, I may have been taught that a bug cannot be summed up in a word, and that a title is not a total encapsulation of a bug's work.
On this we more than disagree, Monomon says with fondness. Call a bug a name enough, and eventually he will respond to it.
Lecture a student enough, and eventually he will have the lecture memorized.
And I will stop saying so when my student learns. I am still your teacher yet, and one day I shall enact the proper procedures to change that name.
Of course, madam.
Mark my words, my student, it will be done.
Shall I mark it along with all the previous times you have told me to mark your words?
Monomon burbles a small giggle before she can help it. Your assistance and such would be invaluable. We wouldn't want them to become disorganized. Quirrell takes great satisfaction in hearing Monomon laugh. But then Monomon turns, and behind her, at the center of her chambers, stands a single tank, still half constructed and without a hatch along the top, oppressively more vast than its peers. And it seems to Quirrell that it is this tank that has stolen the peace and quiet from the archive. Rather than the serenity Monomon usually carries with her as the center of the archive, it's this metal tube that has displaced her and made itself the center of their lives. As Quirrell looks up, Monomon is perfectly framed within the tank's borders, perfectly sized to fit her comfortably. The perfect size to archive a dreamer in her entirety. Mail in this day and age, Monomon says, and holds out a tendril. I suppose that was the reason for the chime, and the reason you've deigned to speak with me again."
"Whatever do you mean?"
Quirrell could say, and keep up the faux politeness game. But he can't do it. She is right. She is his teacher still. Instead, he says,
"I am deeply surprised you could hear the chime at all in this din,"
and holds out the long package, facing her, and she leans in close to read it. She does not take it. She doesn't even touch it. The constant casual motion of her body stops completely. "Thank you, Archivist," she says, with sudden formality. Quirrell feels a pit of dread form in his stomach, and the shallow veneer of normalcy they had been skating on falls apart like so much brittle ice. She looks up at him. "You are familiar with the plan?" Quirrell nods.
"I am, madam."
"When the Pale King approached me, I knew it was my solemn duty to protect the vast wonders of Hollownest. I volunteered for the plan with pride. I know that my sacrifice will ensure the place of Hollownest in history." Quirrell doesn't speak. For a moment, neither does Monomon. "And the flaw," she says in a low voice. The flaw they discovered deep within the last records of the forgotten moth tribe. The single flaw that could kill a dreamer, regardless of whatever seals the weavers wove. "Do I still have your service in this?" Monomon says quietly. The last Quirrell checked, they'd only discovered a flaw, not a way to circumvent it. She'd spoken of the idea that her mask should be removed from Hollownest altogether, ensuring that not even the most obscure of moth lore could be used to breach her mind. In essence, shutting the door and throwing away the key. Quirrell has no idea what on earth she might require of him to make this reality.
"Always, madam. For anything," says Quirrell, without hesitation, and means it.
Her tendrils curl in upon themselves on the floor, and, distantly, Quirrell realizes he's seeing his teacher's nervous tick for the first time on the eve of her death, in front of the tank that will be her grave. Her tendrils clench, then uncurl. Then she begins to pull the ribbons from the box, even while Quirrell holds it in his arms. "It remains between us," she says, referring to the resolve to keep the knowledge from the Pale King. "But the rumors are true. The dead walk under the infection's influence. If we are to do this, my dear student, we cannot go unprepared." Her voice drops to nearly nothing as the filigree lace falls from the box lid, and she says, "I made a request of the Pale King." Quirrell chokes. "You made a what? Of the—" "I had to."
"Madam!"
Quirrell hisses, glancing over his shoulder at the empty hallway.
"Is that wise? To twist the arm of the pale worm?"
He looks at her with disbelief. Never mind if it was wise. Did the Monomon he know even think to make demands of her king? Gods forbid. Was this a sign of infection? "He is not so immovable," Monomon replies, with the same silky, serene tone of voice that declares the argument over before it's begun. "He sees good reason if good reason is given to him."
"What on earth could possibly be worth—"
And Monomon lifts the lid from the box without flourish, no ceremony, and there, in Quirrell's arms, is a nail. It is a nail. It's more than nail. It's not a nail whatsoever. Quirrell thinks this might be what love at first sight looks like. It shines brighter than any nail Quirrell has seen before, on even the highest-born nobles in the most reputable and wealthy courts. Quirrell is no soul master, no shaman, but even he can sense the pale ore singing in its blade, humming on the same frequency as the weaver's most potent spells. Coral doesn't want to know what this costs. He doesn't even want to know how it was made, or who made it, or what Monomon asked of the Pale King that the worm would bestow such a creation upon her. Actually, he doesn't even want to be holding it, as if he might break it, or somehow make it lesser simply by touching it.
Madam, this is...
Monomon inclines her head.
Not going to protect you from a dream nail,
says Coral. He frowns at the nail.
Unless there's a spell upon this that I don't know of. Madam, if you desire to take a weapon with you to your eternal sleep, I shall not stop you, but this is a heavy burden to carry.
Monomon covers the lower part of her mask with a tentacle. Her voice is amused now. Coral.
And pardon me for saying so, I wasn't aware that you knew how to use a weapon. As it stands, I'm not sure that your tendrils have the muscle mass required to lift such a
Coral, says Monomon. This nail is your nail.
It certainly isn't,
says Coral promptly, and without pausing for breath,
Madam, this is hardly a joke with a punchline, and if there is one, I'd be interested to hear it soon. We both know such a nail is not for the likes of me, a common bug of no high birth, nor economic means, nor knighthood.
The times have changed. Coral waves a hand, setting the box on a nearby desk, as if putting distance between him and the weapon might make it go away.
But such a custom could never, madam. The worth of this nail is unfathomable. Even the make of this box is worth more than my entire being. To grant it to one such as I would be unthinkable for the king. No, madam, regardless of what you may have told his majesty, I can't imagine that he'd break every ceremony, every tradition, every scrap of decorum surrounding the highest of high privileges to carry such a nail, and grant one to a common bug who left the royal guard so many decades ago.
And he did not agree at first, no, Monomon interrupts. But Hera had her price. This was mine. Coral falls silent. Monomon waits patiently, as if in a seminar of quiet freshmen, for Coral to speak. He does not. There is no solution but the one we discussed, says Monomon softly. My mask must be taken far beyond the grounds of Hollownest and the old light's reach. The dreamer's seals will not be enough. This, my mask, my face, my mind. I have only ever had my own mind at my disposal, and I gamble with it now. I must recraft my own mind to become the last and most devious lock on the cage that will hold the infection until the end of time. And you will be the old light's most important jailer.
Coral swallows thickly. I couldn't. I'm not.
There's no being in all the world I would trust more to carry my most precious consciousness. I have seen you with a nail. Though your days of common guard duty are behind you, you still carry your skills and reflexes from times long gone.
Those mornings, practicing basic forms and exercises in the courtyard, using the bubbles as simple targets.
He thought he'd been clever, keeping them in the early hours. He hadn't even known she knew about it. It always felt so unbecoming to Coral, an aspect of his old life he couldn't properly leave behind, as if no matter how hard he worked for the title of archivist, and no matter how long he lived in the archive, he would always be back at boot camp, picking up a nail for the first time, terrified at how right it felt in his hand, terrified at who he might become if he stayed. With this nail, with my mask, says Monomon, you will go out into the wastes beyond. There, the infection will never be able to reach you. The nail sings to Coral, even out of his hands and still in its box. The tank is full up of empty acid, bathing Monomon in pale light. He remembers, distantly, that he'd meant to ask Monomon which texts she wanted the tank to be filled with, so that she might have literature to read in the swirling acid of her last sleep. She lived so vibrantly, full of love and words. The thought that she might go into that last dark alone, frozen through with cold and empty water, without even the mind she treasured so dearly to keep her company. "My dear student," says Monomon, "say something."
"Your intellectual work remains inspiring," Coral's mouth says. "Truly, you are a visionary amongst us."
"My dear," says Monomon, quieter, "please."
"Madam,"
says Coral, and nothing else. She waits. Again, nothing. "No, my dear student, archivist, and scholar. I do not ask this lightly."
"I know,"
Coral replies. "You understand as well as I the consequences of wandering."
"I know."
"The infection spreads," she murmurs. "The dead cannot be trusted. The city of tears has taken to burning their corpses. If you were to fall with my mask in your possession, the keystone of this plan would collapse. The old light would use your hands to undo your hard work if you were to pass away. And as her influence spreads, we cannot guarantee that the wastes beyond will remain free of her reach. Even as you go beyond these lands, you must stay alive. You must defend yourself." Monomon lifts the nail from the box with 2 tendrils. With a third, she lifts his chin. He didn't realize he'd been staring at the floor. "Your role in the plan is keystone, linchpin, the small, humble piece that holds it all aloft. Your purpose is noble, your sacrifice glorious. Archivist Quirrell, Hollownest will honor you."
"I don't care," Coral thinks, like an angry child, like a traitor, like an ungrateful louse. "I want no part in this thing that will rob me of you. I do not care. I would rather die than be your murderer."
She holds out the nail to him. Coral, for just a fraction of a moment, considers refusing. Like some spoiled noble son refusing a gift they did not desire. How dare he even entertain the idea of turning down the final request of the woman who has given him everything? Maybe she knows in that moment that he has hesitated for the first time since coming into her service. Maybe this is why she says, in that darnedly gentle voice, "The price I asked of the Pale King was a nail, not for status, not for glory, not for any pride of craftsmanship. I asked for a nail that would never fail you, never rot, never age, never bend nor break. I ask that this nail may serve you well, as you have served me, so that this nail may keep you safe. I ask of you to live." The dull, howling winds of the lands beyond, stripping his mind down to smooth, featureless nothing. The burden of a weapon forever on his hip, a weight he thought left behind him. The loss of his truest friend and confidant, not even to death, but eternal sleep. She reaches for him, a gentle touch to his cheek. "You must live, Quirrell." And at long last, Quirrell takes the nail. For the sake of the plan, Quirrell will live. For Monomon's sake, Quirrell will live.
"What a fine punishment, madam, for your jailer."
He kneels,
on one knee, the way he was taught all those years ago. The tip of the nail points down, standing at attention, in his hands, but in her name. The only proper stance for a knight accepting such an important task from their lord. Deeply he bows his head. His last thought before his eyes turn downward is that Monomon looks unspeakably sad for someone who has, to the best of Quirrell's knowledge, gotten everything she wanted. A small pool of acid burns Quirrell's leg. He ignores it.
Focus up. You can't stand there all day.
Quirrell blinks, shakes his head slightly.
It's your turn to cook dinner. Do I look like I run an inn?
Quirrell tilts his head. Before him stands Lem, looking vaguely cross. Beyond him is the door to a shop. Lem's shop, some 20 paces away. The rain patters distantly.
That's right, Quirrell thinks. I'm in the City of Tears, staying with Relic Seeker Lem. Apologies, I hadn't forgotten, Quirrell says. I was simply lost in thought.
Lem somehow manages to frown more, which is an impressive feat for his general demeanor.
Very lost indeed. I've been calling you for nigh on an age.
An exaggeration, Quirrell tells himself.
Coming,
says Quirrell, and draws the point of his nail from where he'd wedged it into the rotted carpet.
Do you have something in mind?
Surprise me if you somehow can with the contents of my own pantry.
I must admit, I am not much of a cook.
Lem's brow furrows.
You're not?
Is that somehow surprising?
Lem scritches at his own beard thoughtfully.
You seem like the type to cook.
The type?
Yes, very...
Lem waves a vague hand.
Domestic.
Quirrell is so startled that he laughs.
I don't believe I've ever been called a domestic in all my days.
Next, you'll tell me that you don't talk to yourself, even though I've seen you doing it with my own 2 eyes,
mutters Lem and stomps off.
That's odd,
Quirrell thinks, because Quirrell doesn't actually talk to himself and doesn't know when Lem would have ever thought he was. But this seems unimportant in the scheme of things, since Quirrell's about to have to teach himself to cook. And then, as he turns to go, he marvels at the lumaflies in the hallway lamps lighting the way with the same idle offhandedness, and thinks with the same passing idleness,
I wonder what Lem is feeding them to make them so orange and so bright.